I'm Brad Becker. I'm a senior systems engineer on our developer relations team. Been with Jamf for 6 years in various roles, from professional services to research to now developer relations.
And I'm Tani Colwade. I'm a senior software engineer. I've been working on the API for about a year now.
And my name is Doug Roten. I'm a senior software engineer on the integrations team. Today, we're hoping to cover some different uses of the different APIs that we currently have available. And we're going to be going over the customer API, our events API, and then also webhooks. So to start, we have our customer API. Allows you to get, let me get back actually, here. There we go. You can get information out of your JSS, add it, update it, delete it, using the standard HTTP verbs, the get, post, put, and delete. You have your documentation available for you at your URL of your JSS/API. Some typical use cases that you'd have is you update departments and buildings, perhaps on Active Directory information. You might be able to pull information out. Oh, here we go. Let me go back again. Major fail. There we go. So you might want to be able to determine if devices are managed. So we've had some integration partners get into looking up whether a device is managed or not and actually preventing them from going on the network, or perhaps even directing them to a different login page so they actually have to enroll in their JSS. Perhaps you want to update some static groups. Also, it's a nice complement to the Events API or Webhooks, where you might be able to, or need to be able to get more information out of the JSS to supplement what we're sending there. Some new endpoints that we've added since the last JNUC. So command flush, this is where you can flush commands for mobile devices or computers based on a computer group, mobile device group, or even individual devices. Also helpful are some of the endpoints that we've added for getting software or hardware information out of there. So the computer application usage are very helpful. Also have added some things on log flush, mobile device, and also the ability of getting the user based off of an email address. So let's take a look at one particular example here. So you might have heard a while back that the transmission app was hacked. There was actually a virus that was actually injected into it. So version 2.92 was potentially susceptible to having this virus embedded in it. Maybe you wanted to do an API call to find out what computers or users actually had that application installed. So in this case, JSS resource, computer applications, application, transmission app. Transmission app can actually be surrounded by wildcard characters such as the asterisks. So you may be able to use like transmission.star, but you can also specify the specific version as well. Here's an example of the XML that you would actually get back from this particular call. So if you had one or more devices that had this app installed, you'd be able to see that in a collection in this output. Some other endpoints that you may not know about, you have JSS check connection. This is actually an endpoint that returns the version number of the JSS. Also lets you know the JSS is up and available. We often use it in the different integrations to detect what version of the JSS it is. That way we know what API calls are actually available and react accordingly. This is an unauthenticated call that could change in the future. Also be aware, you've heard this morning in the keynote, we're switching to semantic versioning. So right now it is a two dots, or so like a 9.97 or 9.96. If you have a cloud version, you might notice that it's 3 version numbers followed by a .c, but be aware in the future that we'll be switching over to the semantic versioning with the 3 version numbers. We also have subset basic. Subset basic can be used to limit the amount of information that's coming back from your endpoints. It's not always documented on every single endpoint. You can often use it on some that are where it's not listed on the Swagger docs. You can use the subset name and look at, for example, computers where you have location, purchasing, peripherals, hardware, software. You can actually do subset basic or subset hardware. You can even concatenate these child nodes together, so you could do hardware ampersand software. The resulting XML or JSON that you'll get back from the JSS server will include just those nodes. So it's a great way of limiting the amount of information that's actually coming back rather than getting the entire device. We actually use this in the SCCM plugin to find all the devices that have actually been updated since a particular date and time. If you use subset basic for either computers or mobile devices, you'll get a list back of every single computer or every single mobile device, but there will be a date timestamp field, both a UTC and an epoch, where you can use that if you're polling the JSS to see what computers have been updated since a particular point in time, and get only those have done that. That's really helpful with the SCCM plugin, for example. We use that if the network were to go down, the SCCM server were to go down, or the JSS server, the proxy service can actually pick up and resume exactly where it left off, so it's not missing any computers or mobile devices that have been updated during that time. The usage is the endpoint, subset basic, or if you're getting a specific computer, you do ID of the computer, and then subset basic. Here's an example of the JSON you get back from calling just one particular computer. You notice at the bottom you have the report field. And for mobile devices, you would actually have last inventory update, UTC, and epoch. Some other tips when getting into and using the customer API, post or put, or rather post using an ID of 0. You'll get back in the result what the ID of that object is. So if you're adding a new object into the JSS, you'll get that ID back. You can also only post using XML. If you are new to the JSS or new to some of the objects, we definitely recommend populating the data in the JSS first and then using a get statement. That way you can see what information is available for that object in the JSS. Be aware, like computers, mobile devices, you may not see every node until the data is actually published in the JSS. So if you're collecting software information or more detailed hardware information, that may not appear in the output until there's actually data in the database. Also, lastly, use advanced searches to limit the amount of data that's actually returned from the JSS. If you have an advanced search, you can do a get, and it will only return the columns that you have defined in that advanced search. Mentioned before, use that, we can get back either JSON or XML. Make sure you specify the accept type. We actually have been on support cases where customers' JSS servers have flipped from returning XML by default over to JSON. This has been due to, on Mac OS, an upgrade to Java. On Windows, it's a Windows patch. We've seen simple things like reinstalling or removing those patches or that version of Java and reinstalling it, or even rebooting the server, fix it. But if you're expecting a particular content type back, be sure to specify it. One useful tool that we have is Get Postman. It's a free open source utility. You can use that for playing around with the different objects in the JSS, forming puts, forming posts, gets, actually experimenting with that. You can change the accept header or the content type as well and see the output. So some resources available for you. You, of course, have the API documentations available at the JSS URL/API. You also have a couple of nice blog posts from Bryson Terrell. He's an IT administrator here at Jamf. He's put together an unofficial JSS API user guide, as well as a guide for folks getting started with the API. It's super helpful. Also at the end here, we've got the Guest Postman or Insomnia REST. They are two REST clients that you can use for experimenting or playing around with the JSS API. Well, in addition to the customer API, we also have the Events API. This is where you can write up some Java code that listens for and reacts to different events that are occurring in your JSS server. You have two events that you would need to override. You have the event occurred as well as the is registered for events. And there are about 23 different events that actually run there that you can listen for and react to running within the context of Tomcat. Some particular use cases, maybe you want to report inventory to another system in real time, so when an inventory update comes through a for a mobile device or computer, you can send that off to an asset management solution. Or another solution that we've worked on in the past is being able to create certificates from a PKI authority on the fly and then embedding them in configuration profile for the administrator. So before that profile gets pushed down to the mobile device. So it saves that JSS administrator the extra step of having to go and manually get that certificate. So here's an example of some Java code that you would write to wire up the listener here. These examples are actually going to be listed on a later slide where you can actually download some documentation. And here's where you would have a mobile device command. So here's an example of a command that you would run and then listen for an inventory update. You'll notice here we actually have update inventory here as well as acknowledge. If we had listened to every mobile device command that actually comes in, we'd actually end up with about 5 or 6 events that we'd be reacting to. So the nice thing with the Events API is that you have a little bit finer control over what you can actually listen to or respond to. So some advantages here is definitely a finer grained control, as I pointed out. You can actually filter out, so if you're getting too many events, you can fine tune that a little bit. And they're actually filtered out on the server, and you can react to those events in real time as they're occurring. Some disadvantages, you're going to have a higher level of technical expertise, so you're going to need to wire up some Java code there. But the other disadvantages also include every time you upgrade your JSS server, you're going to need to reinstall that plugin. So if you're doing that, we definitely recommend having an upgrade and restore script to help you out with that upgrade process. It also must be installed on the instance of Tomcat. So if you're running a hosted instance, you're only going to be able to do this on a dedicated or custom instance. You're not going to be able to do that in a shared instance. Some resources, there's a JNUC video from a couple of years ago that's still very relevant, as well as a GitHub page that we have up for JAMP that lists out some information on the Events API, as well as on our Developer Resources page. There's actually a document up there that will list the different events that you can listen for, as well as some examples of the Java code as well. And so with the events, we've actually got 23 different ones. But what really makes it nice in the next API that we'll be talking about is that Webhooks has pretty good coverage. So we have a near feature parity of just about every event in the Events API for Webhooks. And with that, I'll hand it off to Brad.
Thanks, Doug. So like Doug mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about webhooks. So in August of this year, we released version 9.93 of the Casper suite. There were plenty of pretty important features within that release, but one of the most important ones in my eyes was webhooks. So before we actually dive into the Casper suite implementation of webhooks, I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a step back. I know a lot of you in this room are probably very familiar with webhooks in your day-to-day from other systems that have already supported them for a long time, but there's probably some people that aren't necessarily familiar with them. So I kind of want to give a general overview. So what are webhooks? Basically, they're just HTTP callbacks or HTTP requests to a specific URL. They're usually triggered in real time by a specific event. And there's actually no standard defined for webhooks, but if you are familiar with kind of general REST API topics, specifically the way that we do things in the Casper suite, you should be pretty familiar, and it should be pretty easy to pick up how we've implemented webhooks. All right, so webhooks in the Casper suite. Like I mentioned earlier, they were introduced in version 9.93 in August of this year. And to actually use them, what you're going to do is basically you register an event, which then posts data. In our case, that data, we give you the option to post in either XML or JSON format, and it posts to a specific URL. And on that URL, there should be some sort of a webhook listener configured that's able to actually receive that data, typically parse through that, pull out the information, and potentially interact with other applications or services utilizing that data. So here's kind of an example of a potential webhook integration. You'll notice that we have a couple of devices that are checking in and submitting inventory to the JSS. We can actually configure webhook events based upon those particular actions, check-in and inventory reports. You could send that event to a particular integration or a third-party service who could then act on that in any way, either sending it on and doing additional API requests to another third party, or actually turning around, taking the information from that webhook and sending it back to the JSS using our customer API that Doug talked about earlier. So how do we actually configure one in the JSS? It's super easy. We have a webhook section now within settings, and there's really three key components to setting up a webhook. The key one, obviously, the URL. So where are we going to actually send this data when we configure it? An IP address or a fully qualified domain name, including the port, is what you're going to want to enter in there. The content type. So like I mentioned earlier, we give you the option of either XML or JSON as a content type to send. And finally, the actual webhook event. So you'll notice here that we have the list of events. This is a list that was on Doug's previous slide in that table. Almost feature parity to the events API, but you can kind of see here a whole lot easier to use. All right, so what does it actually look like when we configure a webhook and it gets triggered and it gets sent to wherever you want to send it? What does it look like? This is an example of the JSON that would get sent for a particular webhook. You'll notice that it's really simple in structure. It's just a JSON object with two members that contain simple dictionaries with a handful of values inside of them. So here's the kind of the XML equivalent to that previous slide. Again, very simple, very similar in format to the JSON. So why do we want to use webhooks instead of or in conjunction with our other APIs? Well, obviously they're immediate. So it happens exactly when an event occurs instead of potentially requiring regular polling like we would have to with like the customer API. It's very targeted, so we can trigger it on a specific event. And it's also flexible. So you noticed in the previous slides, it's actually a really minimal payload in a webhook. We don't actually send a whole bunch of data in there, but the data that we do send will allow you to hopefully do some additional API calls against the JSS using the customer API if you wanted more detailed information. So what are some potential use cases? A big one that we run into is chat. So a lot of people recently have wanted to notify a chat room if an event occurs. So you use HipChat or Slack, something like that, and you want to notify that room, let's say when a software title in the JSS has been updated. You can absolutely do that with webhooks if that system supports accepting them. An asset management system. So this is kind of an interesting one. A lot of times what I've seen happen is that there's a disconnect between the Casper suite and asset management systems, either technically or socially. And those systems a lot of times get out of sync. If you implement webhooks and that asset management system supports it, you could basically configure a webhook to trigger and notify the asset management system whenever a new computer has enrolled in the JSS, for example. And of course, email. It's kind of the old standby. Everybody loves to get an email on events that occur. One example is sending an email notification to a list of people when a computer has unenrolled from the JSS. So those are some kind of theoretical use cases. I did want to dive in and actually talk about a real-world use case, and that's actually something that we've used internally at Jamf over the past couple of months. And that's the ServiceNow Jamf macOS integration. So if you all were at the keynote this morning, you heard Dean and others talk about this ServiceNow integration. And a major component of that integration is actually communicating out, ServiceNow instance communicating out with your Jamf server and pulling inventory data back into it. That works great. It's fairly trivial to get that to happen using our customer REST API. But what we did struggle with as we were going through and developing this was how do we actually keep that inventory data in sync once we have that initial pull? Usually what we would have done is we would have configured some sort of a regular polling schedule. We can run into problems with that. How often do you go ahead and poll? How does that affect the scalability and the performance of both the Jamf server and also the ServiceNow instance? Thankfully, in the midst of this development, we came out with Webhooks, which pretty much solved our problem there. So here's a diagram of how we have basically set this up to ensure that inventory data remains up to date in the ServiceNow instance. So you can see computers will submit their inventory updates to the JSS, or to the Jamf server. And we actually have a computer inventory completed webhook configured so that every time a computer does submit their inventory, the JSS lets the ServiceNow instance know about that. And then the ServiceNow instance actually parses that JSON that we send over, and it picks out the ID, and then it does a pretty simple get back to the JSS and pulls back the detailed inventory information for just that specific computer without the need for regular polling. And it also gets you basically real-time data. Both systems are always in sync. So troubleshooting webhooks. Let me preface this by saying that webhooks are pretty straightforward. There's not a whole bunch of moving parts associated with them, so hopefully there shouldn't be too many troubleshooting steps you'll need to take. But sometimes you do want to kind of take a look and figure out what's going on behind the scenes, and there's a couple of ways that we can do this. So obviously the first one is the Jamf software server log file. So we're going to log every single success and every single failure of a webhook event within the Jamf software server log file. And we log these under the Webhook processor class. So all one word, Webhook processor. So if you go through and you filter that out or search for that, that will bring back all these events. Again, both successes and failures. And on both a success and failure, it should write out pretty much exactly what's happening, and that's typically an HTTP status code that will point you in the right direction of kind of what's going on with your webhook. Why is it failing, or why is it succeeding? There are a few third-party tools I wanted to point out as well that I use in my day-to-day going through and utilizing webhooks. One of them is RequestBin. So RequestBin is one that I've just recently run into. It's a free online tool made by a company called RunScope. They do a lot of API analytics and monitoring software, but this is actually a free online tool that allows you to go out to their website and basically configure up an open webhook receiver on the internet. So you would go out, click a button, and it's going to give you a URL that you can send webhooks to. Then you could configure up the JSS or any other system that sends webhooks, send it to that URL, and RequestBin is going to actually show you exactly what it received. So the body, the header, things like that, which is pretty interesting and pretty useful sometimes to figure out exactly what's getting sent. Another tool, again, Postman. Doug mentioned this earlier. I actually like to use Postman in conjunction with RequestBin. You can set up Postman. Now that you know the syntax of how the JSS actually sends out webhooks and what format, you could actually replicate webhooks without a JSS. So you could set up Postman to post to RequestBin and see what comes through and go through without any sort of JSS in play if you're not able to test it out. So it's kind of a cool tool to use in conjunction with RequestBin. So a couple of resources I wanted to point out. This first link is a link to a discussion right after we released version 9.93 in August. It was started by our own Bryson Terrell, kind of the webhooks champion, and it's kind of an announcement and a discussion around webhooks, how they work, and getting a discussion going. A lot of good information within that discussion. And then that second link is actually a link to Bryson's GitHub repository for webhooks. Excuse me, he's created a lot of different webhook JSS integrations, and actually other people have contributed to that GitHub repository as well. So I would recommend if you're looking to integrate with a system or service, check that out before you go down and do the work. The work might have already been done for you. So that's kind of what we have in terms of our current APIs. We do have one more thing that we want to kind of talk about today, something that we're pretty excited about, and that's a new API, the Universal API, and I'm actually going to hand it off to Tani to discuss that.
Thanks, Brad. So what is the Universal API? It's a new, more modern API that we've started to build out for the JSS. Like our existing customer API, it's RESTful, but it expands on the customer API and has some additional features and benefits. To start with, it uses token-based authentication. So the existing customer API, you need to pass your username and password using basic auth to every API call. With the Universal API, you're able to use either SAML or basic auth to retrieve a token and use that on future API calls. We also use versioning in the Universal API. You can see a little sample of how we version. We're using the URL, so it's easy to specify which version of the API you want. If we have new features or updated features that make us need to change our payloads, we can version the API so that we don't break existing integrations. We're also going to support pagination and sorting to make searching for objects easier. And we're using JSON for all of our operations because it's more lightweight, easier to read, and most languages support parsing JSON. We're making our payloads lighter, and we're defining the entire schema in our Swagger docs, so you no longer need to preload the payload to know what it will look like. So why did we build a new API? We see it as a complement to our existing API, but it has all the features and benefits that were listed on the other slide. It also provides us more flexibility to build new functionality, and we have product functionality linked to it, so we're actually building out new features and functionality in our products using the Universal API. And the first Universal API endpoints actually shipped with version 9.9.3 of the JSS. So if you have version 9.9.3 or later, you already have access to the Universal API. You can see the Swagger docs for it at the /uapi/doc URL. If you view the source of the API, like I mentioned earlier, we do define the whole schema. So you're able to grab the Swagger schema from the source code, and you can use one of the many tools that Swagger has to parse it and generate source code for calling the API. And we're actually really interested in your input and feedback on the Universal API. There's a very limited amount of endpoints right now, but we're going to be building out more in the future. So if you're interested in providing us input and feedback, you can either see me after this presentation or stop by our product management booth. Also, you can leave feature requests on Jamf Nation. Just be sure if you're upvoting a feature request, you leave a comment so we know who you are and we can contact you. So that's all that we have, but here's some related sessions that are going on.
Thanks, guys. All right, a couple questions came in on Twitter that I'll go through real quick here. I think some of these were answered during the presentation, but it never hurts to say it again. The first one, can you manually flush logs via the API?
There is the log flush command right now in the API, and that would be in the customer API. And does that take care of that?
Yeah, sure. Elaborate, how do you do it?
See the Swagger docs, there's information in there how to do that. So.
Perfect, thank you. Cool, great. Let's see, what's another one here? This one's a fun one. What is the most creative use of the Jamf API you've encountered?
That's a hard question. The most creative use that I've done is the one that I actually talked about with the webhooks. I mean, there's a lot of other integrations that I've heard of, pretty basic ones for like network access control, things like that, pulling back compliancy data from your devices and then using that on your NAC to basically allow or disallow access. But really the webhooks is kind of the coolest one that I've ever done.
One that I just resolved with the SCCM plugin, where we go and get all the information for a computer and we store that locally, and then we go and get the information again, and we actually generate a diff between the two. So that way we're actually reporting only the differences up to SCCM. Advantage there is the SCCM tends to eat up a lot of disk space if you're sending over full inventory reports all the time.
All right, next one. Is there a Jamf built tool that can generate smart groups via the API?
I don't believe so. Doug, do you know of one?
I'm not aware of one.
Okay, I don't believe so.
Okay.
I'll just comment that the folks that make auto packager, Lindy Group, they actually have some code that creates smart groups via the API. And so if somebody wants to check that out, good resource.
Sure. There's a comment that there is another entity that made some script. If you can post in the discussion board for this session with that, that would be great. Thank you. All right. SCCM plugin. What advantage is there to using the Jamf SCCM plugin over using config manager clients on the Macs? And if that's a in-depth topic, you can give us a simple answer.
That'd probably be more in-depth, but come see me afterwards.
All right, just two more here, and I'm going to... Oh, I'm sorry. Going this way. Sorry about that, guys. Do webhooks also run on the JSS?
Do they also
Do they run on the JSS?
do they run on the JSS? I guess yes. That's where they're triggered from.
No, is the JSS listening for webhooks?
No, not at this point. I do think that there is a feature request out there. I'm not 100% certain on it, but my guess is that there's a feature request out there. Or if there's not, there probably will be one shortly. But it would be a great feature request, long story short.
Next 5 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you. And can you use webhook events and webhooks if they are running on Jamf Cloud?
Yes. Yeah.
Tossing you a softball there. All right, let's do this one. Do webhooks contain the device that initiated the event?
Yes, it will contain the ID of the device. So, like in my example of the computer inventory update, it will contain the ID of the device that submitted its inventory to the JSS or Jamf server.
All right, a couple of them I'm going to bundle together here, some specific items that people are wondering if they can pull from the API, and if you don't know off the top of your head, we can refer to the documentation later. But the first is, can you pull a computer lock code from the API? And the second one was, is there a direct call to the JSS API that can acquire a user's Active Directory username?
I'm not sure about either of those. I'd have to check the documentation on that. Doug, do you know off the top of your head?
I think some customers have actually put that Active Directory information in an extension attribute, and once it's in the extension attribute, you're able to pull that via the API.
Great.
And I'm refreshing as we're going, so keep firing them away. Last one I have here, any specific reason for using JSON for the Universal API over XML?
Like I mentioned, we thought it was easier to read. A lot of languages support parsing it. So that was the choice that we were made.
Any plans to add in the future?
To add XML? Not at this point, no.
All right, I'm going to do one more refresh, so type quickly. All right, I think that's it. I'll review them later, so if I didn't ask your question, I apologize, but I'll make sure to follow up with it. So thanks again, everybody, for attending, and let's have another round of applause for these guys.